ladies and gentlemen, it's with a great honor and pleasure that I welcome you all to the 2023 IBHA Conference, Humanity on a Finite Planet, a Big History Perspective, promoted by the International Big History Association. At this crucial moment of the planet, we gather here to explore the challenges faced by humanity on our finite planet and seek a broad perspective, big history, that allows us to understand our trajectory and the paths we must tread. I would like to express my gratitude to the American Historical Association for granting the funds that made this event possible. I would like to thank David Blanks, the president of the IBHA, for his tireless efforts in securing this support. I would like to thank also Donatu and Heath Eckley for their invaluable support. They are crucial part of this organization. And I would like to also thank Chilo Gustafsson for organizing this conference. Thank you very much, Lo, for this. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Professor Fred Spier. I wish you all a conference filled with learning and discoveries. Thank you very much. Professor, please go ahead. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Al. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you very much, all those members of the International Big History Association who are currently online and who are going to listen to what I have to say, and especially also those who invited me to give this presentation. So the title of my presentation, as you can see, is How Did Humanity Get Itself into its Current Ecological Predicament? And that question was a question posed in a report published in 1972 under the title The Limits to Growth, a famous report, a computer model ordered by the so-called Club of Rome, a number of intellectuals and business people who were very concerned about the future of human life on the planet, and they had this study done at the MIT. I'm not going to talk about that study, but in the foreword of the Dutch and perhaps also other versions of that study, but not the American version, as far as I know, there was the question, or rather the remark, that we will only be able to formulate good plans for the future when we know how we got ourselves into this situation. I'm not exactly paraphrasing, but that was the content, basically. So that is what I read at the time, and it really worried me. I was studying chemistry at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands at the time. And I continued doing that, but it became increasingly clear to me that the study of chemistry did not offer great solutions to that question. So I became more and more worried that I didn't find any answers anywhere else at that time. So I did finish my chemistry study, and but decided to discontinue that further as a career and didn't really know what to do. So I started to drift for a couple of years doing all kinds of things, including working 1 year on an ecological farm. And then I realized step by step that ecological problems are social problems, first of all. Without humanity, there wouldn't have been any ecological predicament, obviously. So I started what is now a 40-year-long research project without knowing that that's what I was doing, that it would take so long. And in doing so, I encountered important theoretical aspects that really helped me a lot to find answers to those questions, answers that at least personally satisfy me. So I'm not really going to talk a lot about how we got ourselves into this current predicament, but rather what are the theoretical tools that I have found very useful for doing so. And they're not only useful for understanding that question, but I think for a great many questions in big history. So let me start. But first I want to say that there's this famous statement by Sir Francis Bacon, the English scientist, philosopher, and statesman, that nature is only to be commanded by obeying her. And he said that at the beginning of the rise of modern science. And he said, well, you have to learn to understand nature, you have to obey the laws of nature as we are beginning to understand them, and then you can command nature. But the same applies to our situation in the biosphere. You have to know and understand the biosphere to be able to do something with it. And we don't have any other option right now than to command the biosphere wisely. That's the extraordinary influence of our species currently. So it's not enough to have a story about it, we have to understand it. And when I went into the social sciences, I started studying culture anthropology, and I was very lucky to find a teacher, Mark Bucks, say a few words more about him later, who was advancing the concept of what he called religious regimes. It was a specific type of regime, and here you see on the photo such a specific regime, a photo that I took in the Peruvian Andean village of Zurita, where you see a little procession. And it sort of exemplifies all the aspects, all the major aspects that I think are important. And first of all, they're constellations of human interdependencies. A bit like there are so many of them. You could say, well, if you're a member of a soccer club, whether you call it soccer or football, depends on where you are on the planet, then you are a member of a group, a certain constellation of human interdependencies. But as soon as you leave that club and you get onto the road, you find yourself in a different constellation of human interdependency, namely the traffic rules, etc., etc. So there are a great number of regimes currently in the world that humans have to deal with, and we do that virtually effortless. But as soon as you start thinking about it, then it becomes very interesting, I think. And also want to emphasize what I'm saying now is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of theory of regimes. But this is a very important aspect, that these constellations of human interdependencies, and these constellations can be seen as balances of power and dependency. So some people may have more power and more dependent on others, and then the other way around. And you can research that. And then, to some extent, structured processes, like everything in the universe. So, they interact with other regimes. So you can think about the interactions between state and church regimes, for instance. That was a favorite subject of Mark Bucks, and that's also what I started studying in Peru. And they contain standards of behavior, of conduct, how to behave or how not to behave. And it doesn't mean that all people always behave in certain ways. What it does mean is that also when people behave differently, other people refer to those regimes as the standards. Oh, that's weird. He doesn't stick to the traffic rules, something like that. And then there's an aspect of needs and constraints. That means you would like to do that. You would like to stick to the traffic rules because it makes you safe on the road. And you may want to force others to do so too, who are driving recklessly. And that in principle applies to all regimes, that situation. There's always a balance between needs and constraints. So you can ask the question about that little procession there that you're seeing on the picture. Well, who would want to do what, and who felt compelled to do what, and why? Those things you can ask. And let me give a few more examples. As many of you may have seen or even watched, in Britain, a new king was crowned, and that happened in a church, Westminster Abbey, and the whole ceremony was completely dominated by priests, which is kind of interesting because, you know what, it is a parliamentary democracy, and it prides itself on the motto of parliament. But there were virtually absent, at best some side roles. Yet after the Queen had died, there was the so-called Accession Council, which consisted of the Privy Council, which is people of Parliament, and a bit more extended. So an interesting regime. And although there were some religious functionaries there too, they didn't really show very much. And so that was a ceremony completely dominated by very different people, a different regime, so to speak. And then when the king got out of the church and went in a parade to his palace, then neither of those two groups were present. There weren't any parliamentary people, there weren't any priests in the parade. It was the king, the family that he elected to be with him, plus soldiers and some police. A very different regime again. And for all these regimes, you can ask those questions and you can wonder how they are related, how that happened over time. And as soon as you start mentioning that in terms of regimes, then you may begin to see how useful that concept is for mapping reality. It is not just that you say, okay, first there was the Accession Council, then there was the coronation, and then was the parade, which is all correct. But if you look at them as regimes, then suddenly you can ask far more specific sociological questions and may get very interesting answers. And one of these things is all the three of them have in common is that they're very strict. I didn't see anybody break the rules. Now, why is that? What's going on there? I'm not going to go into that, but it's a very interesting question, I think. Anyway, so the regime approach I first learned from Mart Baks, a cultural anthropologist in the Netherlands, to whom I really owe a lot, really learned a lot from him. And that was based on the sociology of the German sociologist Norbert Elias, whose work at the time was becoming more known in the Netherlands, not least because he was living in Amsterdam. I think it's very, very useful sociology, and the further development formulated by Mart Baks turned out to be very, very useful for my research. And then later I became acquainted with the Dutch sociologist Johan Goudsblom, who was very close friend of Norbert Elias. In fact, Norbert Elias lived upstairs in the same house as Goudsblom. So that was a pretty closely knit society, and I really learned a lot from them. And also later, together with Joop and with Mart, we discussed a lot about regimes, and we saw the use of it. And my tag was that as part of my investigation in how we got ourselves into our ecological predicament, I wanted to know how people were dealing with nature that were more directly dependent on nature. People like us who are living in urban situations, we are not directly dependent on nature in many ways. We don't really know where the food comes from. We certainly don't grow it ourselves. And as a result, we might care less about the land where it's grown. Well, these people who do know where it comes from because they grow themselves, they may be more careful. That was the major reason why I wanted to go to Peru to learn those things from those Andean farmers. And I did so. And I started doing that in 1985 and turned out to become a process for more than 10 years. And but at the time, in cultural anthropology in the Netherlands, it was totally impossible to formulate such a project. What was possible was to think that ecological rituals might appear in their religion and therefore turn out to be very necessary to study their religions. And because religions always have political aspects, it turned out to be very important to study politics of religion. And that's how Mart Baks and I became involved. But I realized at the time, and Joop Goudsblom later formulated the concept of social regimes and ecological regimes. You can think about different types of regimes. For instance, that little procession, that is a social regime mostly, because it's basically people dealing with each other. There are, of course, ecological effects, but it is not mainly directed towards changing the ecology, but growing things. And in the second photo, you can see people basically plowing the land with the aid of food plows. They call them chakitaklia, which means food plow. It's in Quechua. That is very much directed to influencing nature, influencing the ecology. And it also has a social effect, but its main thrust is towards doing something with the rest of nature. So I found those concepts very useful, and so we elaborated all of that. And as you can see, these regimes are very useful, efficient map-making tools for social situations. Okay, so a procession is typically a religious social regime, and plowing the land in a traditional Andean way, that is an ecological regime. And if you start using that systematically, you have a very efficient social map-making tool that helps you to understand human history at all scales, from a very small scale to the largest possible scale. And it also includes our actions within the biosphere. Well, so much about the theory of those regimes. And it ended up in two books that I wrote at the time, a long-term history of religion and politics in Peru, zooming in and zooming out on that particular village of Zurite, where I had done my research, and that has become so very dear to me. And a few case studies in the second book that I studied at the time in greater detail, because if you do a long-term history, there's not a lot of detail you can add to that. So both in terms of regime, and I would certainly emphasize that without that concept, I would not have been able to write those books, and quite possibly my research would have failed. That would not have surprised me. I was quite at a loss before I became familiar with the concept, and I'm still using it, and I still find it extraordinarily useful. Anyway, and then we started doing big history. Joop Goudsblom and I, we set up a course at the University of Amsterdam following David Christian's pioneering examples. So a course that is taught by specialists in all the different fields. I guess you're familiar with that. And I realized then, while I was doing that you could also use the concept of regime for constellations of non-human interdependencies. For instance, atoms, molecules, cells, everything from there up to galaxies, and in fact the whole universe. And as a result, you could think of human regimes as a special subcategory of a far more general category of regimes. And again, I found that a very, very useful way of describing big history, not least because you can look at all these regimes as interacting. So we are part of the, let's say, the biosphere, which you can look at as one single regime, and that's part of the Earth, a bit bigger regime, and then that's part of the solar system, bigger regime, etc. And you can wonder how all these regimes are interacting in a systematic manner, and that is what I like to emphasize. It helps you to think theoretically in a very systematic way. You always have to wonder, of course, what may escape your attention by applying such a theory. So if you see things around you, empirical observations that do not fit such a scheme, then you may wonder, perhaps we need to change the scheme a little. But I haven't really found that so far. But still, you have to be careful, I think. So that led to my little book called The Structure of Big History, from the Big Bang until today, published in 1996. It might have been wiser to call the book A Structure of Big History, but then, no, that's what it became anyway. So I found that regimes seen in such a way, again, are a very efficient tool for mapping all of reality in its past, including our human actions and effects within the biosphere. And furthermore, we have certainly an analytical tool that can help us to reunite all the sciences. I don't know of that many theoretical tools that can do such a job. And although that book was published a long time ago, as you can see, almost 30 years, this year a Spanish translation of that book has been published in Spain, including a number of articles that also follow the regime approach. And that book was put together, and the initiative was taken not by me, but by my friend Luis Bertran Almeria, who is a professor of literature studies at the University of Zaragoza in Spain. There you see a picture of him. So I owe that to him. And currently, in the Spanish-speaking world, this book is being discussed, and it has raised some interest, I would say. That is a whole story by itself. And it also shows, I think, how different those conversation regimes, you could say, are in the different language areas. And I think what's happening in the Spanish-speaking world, which is some sort of a regime, no doubt, can hardly be observed within the English-speaking world or the Dutch-speaking world or whatever. Just like I cannot possibly gauge what's happening in the Chinese-speaking world or the Arabic-speaking world. So what we have is all these language regimes in which discussions may be taking place that are virtually invisible to people who not speak those languages until they get translated. That's the current situation. Anyway, but I'm fortunate that I can participate to some extent in those Spanish conversations thanks to my research in Peru, where I had to learn Spanish the hard way. But it was great fun a lot of the time. And people were always very kind to me, even when I made considerable errors. Anyway, so the next step became that I started wondering, how can you explain regimes? Is that possible? And for many years I thought, no, that is beyond my reach. That is not doable. But then I started to realize that complex regimes, they are rare. Most of the universe is virtually empty. It's big, it's cold. And places where there is more complexity, they're relatively rare, and the Earth, that's a very rare place, right? And I was very much stimulated to think along those lines when I became acquainted with the work of the US astrophysicist Eric Chasen, now at Harvard University, and then, well, anyway, he has a very interesting career. And he was a pioneer. He had preceded David and certainly me, at least 10, perhaps 15 years, starting to organize a course in cosmic evolution, I think in 1978 at Harvard University, together with an astrophysicist, George Field, also an American. And as a result, he had already written books about these things when David and later I started. I became aware of his work thanks to the emergent internet, when in 1998 I was staying for a while on the West Coast, and I was searching the Amazon website, which was then still mostly a book-selling website, but they were connecting second-hand booksellers to the site. So I started browsing that, and I found his books, and also through the internet I found his email address. I contacted him and invited him to come and speak in our course, which he did, and that's what the photo is from. And then he was working on the book published the next year called Cosmic Evolution, The Rise of Complexity in Nature, which I think is a pioneering study in many ways, in which he thought to explain the rise and to some extent of the demise of regimes, and using thermodynamics. And for those who are not familiar with that, it is important to know a little bit about, say, how that works. And my way of explaining is usually to look at this cup where you see cappuccino with some milk foam in it, and you see that smiley face, and you know right away that did not appear all by itself. Someone made it. Such things simply do not appear by themselves. And you also know what's going to happen over time. It's going to disappear. And that is the essence of what is known as the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe becomes more chaotic, more messy, one could say, over time. And that raises the question, where does the complexity come from? Because you would expect that to disappear. And the need for that, and that is work done by Belgian, Russian scientist who no longer lives, Ilya Prigogine, is basically you need an energy flow through matter to make that happen. And otherwise, you won't get it. I could say a lot about that because again and again, what I'm saying is just the tip of the iceberg. But okay, that's perhaps the nature of such talks that I'm doing now. And if you want to think about what is needed for the continued existence of complexity, then say it all depends. If you have a rock just moving around through space, then you don't really need a lot to keep that going. It will slowly but surely disintegrate, but it may take a lot of time for that to happen. But if you have a star, then you also need a flow of energy to keep it going. If not, it will collapse. And if you have more complex things such as life forms, they definitely need it. I don't need to explain that. And if you want to build things and maintain them, such as this mega hotel in Mecca, then of course you also need a flow of energy to keep it going, etc., etc. Many more things could be said about it, but that is the general principle. So then you can wonder what drives living regimes on the earth, and we're now coming back to our theme of how did we get ourselves into our ecological predicament. Then we have to think of two energy sources that are energy from within, emanating from within, reaching the surface. And some organisms live by that, but most organisms live actually by sunlight that falls on the planet. It's captured by plants and then eaten by animals, etc. And you could say that what for the sun, when it leaves the sun, the light is low quality energy because the sun is so hot. It's low quality, but when it gets on our planet, it's far hotter than the surface of the planet, so therefore it's high quality energy. And it gets converted in different ways, including being captured by life into low energy. As a result, the chaos, the entropy rises, and it gets radiated out into the universe again. So we get rid of that. If we didn't get rid of it, the planet would heat up very quickly. And you could say that with the current climate change, that what's happening is that a little less energy leaves the planet than comes in. But that's very little, but enough to heat it up. So that is the general situation. And then you can think of the biosphere as an apple. If you think of the biosphere as an apple, how thick would it be? Well, it is actually thinner than the skin of an apple. So if you have an apple and you peel the skin off, you remove the entire biosphere. It's gone. And as a result, you would not only want to understand the biosphere or parts of it, you would also want to know what's inside of it, and you want to know what's outside of it. Without that knowledge, you will not understand the biosphere. So you have to look at it in zooming in and zooming out again, much like I did with the village of Surite in Peru, where I did my research. I'm not talking about a certain computer company, not talking about earlier records, of course, just about the Earth, comparing it to an apple. And then there is this principle that's probably also familiar to most of you, the idea that to get that kind of complexity, energy flows are not enough. You also need special conditions to do that. And the conditions depend on the type of complexity you're talking about. For instance, our sun needs a lot of empty, cold space around it to get rid of its entropy, its radiation. While we here on the planet, we need a very benign, for us at least, regime that allows us to keep going. We may not be aware of that every day, but just think about if you're traveling, let's say, 40, 50 kilometers from where you are along the surface of the planet, not a lot may change depending on which way you go. But if you go 50 kilometers down, there's no chance to survive that. And you go 50 kilometers up, there's no chance to survive it either. It's a really very thin layer where life exists and where you have Goldilocks circumstances for life. So the question then is, how did that happen? How did they come about? But the general point here is that you have this energy approach of complexity plus the Goldilocks regimes that sort of provides an underlying historical theory of everything. It doesn't mean that it replaces all the other theories. That's not the point. It is an underlying theory that helps to explain all forms of complexity throughout the entire history of the universe. And that was when I realized all of that, I wrote my book of 2010, Big History and the Future of Humanity, which is based on that model. And then there was an updated version in 2015 for a particular reason that I don't want to go into. But these books, they help basically not only describe, but also explain at the basic level all regimes during all of history, including again human actions and their effect on the biosphere. So that's two. And now the last theme that I want to talk about. I started at a certain point thinking about systematic interactions, joints, effects of regime. And that happened by pure coincidence. And that's what I'm going to describe right now. And that led to my most recent book. It's called How the Biosphere Works, Fresh Views Discovered While Growing Peppers. And that's how it happened. So that's why the title is like it is. And what, in a general way, what I found that by investigating important joint effect of living regimes, and suddenly we got an analytical approach that improves our understanding of the biosphere and its history, including our current environmental predicament. So what happened? I was cultivating pepper plants in our apartment, a little apartment, and I noticed in August that those plants were making so many leaves that I became intrigued, because leaves are solar collectors, right? It's solar panels. And they were sitting in a relatively small flower pot. And I was wondering, how much would the combined leaf surface be compared to the surface of the flower pot they were sitting in? And so I measured that approximately, and I found that it was a factor of 20 times as big. And that set me thinking really a lot. And then in September, it was even more, it was about 30 times. So that meant that basically those plants together, those solar capturing regimes, were jointly maximizing the capture of solar energy. I was not going to say that one single plant was doing that, but jointly, clearly, that's what they were doing. So I started thinking about life on the planet. Here you see a photo of the Amazon region, where you see that process in action. You see jointly all those trees and whatever grows below them, they are tending towards maximizing the capture of solar energy. And even in an arm of that river, When it's stagnant, as you can see, it's green. The same process happens, only where the water flows and the muddy water flows off towards the sea, then it takes any species that try to live there with them. So perhaps that's not. So it immediately shows also the importance of the concept of Goldilocks circumstances. And you need that. If there's water, it will happen. If there's no water at all, it won't happen. If there's too much water, it will flow away, etc. And here is a picture that I took almost 5 years ago in a little town in northern Spain, Salas in Asturias, which exemplifies nicely, in my opinion, the effect of human action on such a situation. There you see in the distance some forests, some woodlands. It's not clear to me to what extent they are managed. They probably are, but at least you can see that there is much more maximization of solar energy capture than in other places where humans are active. So what humans influence this and how? Now, first, I want to mention two pioneers in that respect, and the first one is Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, who came originally from Ukraine and wrote a book. It's called The Biosphere. It was published, as you can see, almost 100 years ago in Russian, and then a bit later in French, and that was because I'm saying earlier in French, and that was because he was living there, and only far more recently in English. And it dealt systematically with the influences of life on geology, creating the biosphere. He had a bit of a different definition of the biosphere than I have, but it was a very influential book, and in the Russian Federation and also in Ukraine, I think, he is considered as important as Charles Darwin is in the Anglo-Saxon world. I'm not going to summarize the book, but in my pepper book, so to speak, I do pay a lot of attention to his work. And another pioneer is James Lovelock, the British scientist who developed this Gaia concept, where it's not only influences, but also regulation plays a role. Again, the tip of the iceberg in both cases. And also Charles Darwin needs to be mentioned with his struggle for life, because that plays an important role in biological theory, obviously. But I started asking myself the question, but how do organisms wage the struggle for life? And curiously, not a lot appears to have been said about that very fundamental question in biological literature. And my general answer is by using survival strategies. So these pepper plants were making lots of green leaves to capture as much solar energy as possible, and then make the stems and make the pods and the seeds fall to the ground, get eaten perhaps by birds and be dispersed, and then the whole cycle or loop starts again. That's their business model. It's not my business model and not your business model either. We have very different business models, and so have many other species. So you can look at all the different species that exist as having different business models. And there you see another systematic approach emerging. And you could call these business models also certain forms of regimes, right? And the important thing here to emphasize is that all those regimes have been honed by the process of natural selection. If they work well, they survive. If they don't work very well, they get weeded out. And an important aspect of that situation is that capturing energy is a most important portion of survival regime. Without capturing energy, there will be no complexity. As simple as that, no biological complexity, whether it's humans or plants or whatever. So that led me to the formulation, perhaps a little bit optimistic, of what I call a fourth law of thermodynamics, saying that life as a whole tends towards maximizing the capture of the available free energy flows, which is a joint effect of all these actions of all these living regimes. And the first law, just to mention that, is the conservation of energy in principle. Energy is not lost, it can only be converted, not thinking about nuclear processes. And the second law I just mentioned, the entropy tends towards maximum. And the third law is that it tends towards a certain value when the system as a whole becomes very cold and big, and etc. Anyway, so you can think of the food pyramid as what I prefer to say now, the food capturing pyramid, consisting of what I call the primary captors, and it's mostly solar energy, and the secondary captors who start eating the primary captors, and also in that process jointly seeking to maximize their capture of solar energy, and the tertiary capture, etc., etc. It's a bit of a different view, and I find it very useful, and not least because you can ask the question, what about microorganisms? And some of them don't live off solar energy, they live off geothermal energy. And so if you look at it that way, then suddenly you realize, hey, we don't have one single food capturing pyramid, we have two. And how do they interact? I'm not going to go into that, but that's an interesting question, which I don't, at least I haven't seen it, has not been posed by anybody else so far. I mean, people just talk about food pyramid as if it is one. But as soon as you start focusing on capturing energy, you see there must be two. Now, another aspect that I think is very important is the aspect of nonlinear growth. I started thinking about it systematically when the COVID pandemic was spreading very rapidly. Obviously, those little viruses could replicate extraordinarily fast. And I wondered, what about the other life forms? So I started calculating that and measuring it. So I found in my measurements that one red pepper seed yielded on average about 400 new seeds per plant. So if you think about that, and you think that if one single pepper seed yields one plant, and the next generation you have 400 plants, if everything goes well, which yield, etc., etc. So I calculated that in less than 10 generations, starting with one single pepper seed in my Amsterdam apartment, those pepper plants would cover the entire earth, including all the oceans. That was a staggering conclusion, but inevitable. So there's a lot of, let's say, non-linear growth potential in pepper plants too. It was not only COVID. And you could say that, in fact, almost all organisms have such a potential non-linear growth power. So you could say the food pyramid, as it's usually called, is actually a very dynamic food capturing pyramid. And if the circumstances get right, one species can suddenly pop out and increase beyond anything it had done before, such as COVID. And then you can wonder, of course, what about nonlinear decay? And if you now start looking at all the things together, you can wonder, what about life's effects within the biosphere during all of its history? Well, that's what I try to do in my book. This one chapter is devoted to my attempt to describe that, including the effects of the emerging and developing food capturing pyramid within the biosphere as it develops. And it's a first attempt. I cannot claim any final analysis of it, but I haven't seen at least one single such attempt before in a systematic manner. So it may be new ground is being broken. And then you can wonder what happened when humans emerged. And let's say, if you think about the period of 7 million years ago, that is the most recent 0.15% of the biosphere's history. It's very little. And so the biosphere was happily going along, doing all the things, and then suddenly one species pops out. And that species starts to form its own food capturing pyramid states. And in the process starts transforming the biosphere almost beyond recognition in an extraordinarily short period of time. So that led me to the formulation of a fifth law of thermodynamics, namely a law that kicks in as soon as one single species tends toward jointly maximizing the capture of the available free energy while using it for their own purposes. So it was no more all, let's say, all green species together. No, just one single species who does that, us. And to give just one single example of such a situation, here you see a picture of windmills north of Amsterdam, as they were roughly 150 years ago. And you see all those windmills are very close together. They couldn't be much closer together because they would capture each other's wind. And in fact, in those days, there were regulations spacing out windmills, etc. And if you look now down, if you fly from Amsterdam to London, which I did 4 years ago, and you look down there, you see our modern windmills capturing wind, also being spaced out in certain ways, also a regime. So. And this is just one example of many such general processes that began to take place as soon as the circumstances were sufficiently right. So now I'm coming to the end of my presentation and will try to summarize what I would call major human regime transformations of the biosphere. And you could say, well, we started out perhaps really influencing the biosphere some 2.5 million years ago. Very few people, so not a lot of influence when people started making tools. But even then, you could say, well, you know what, other animals were also making tools. So that influence was not very specific. It had some influence, but not too much. But that started somewhere. But clearly, as soon as people started to domesticate fire, things changed because no other species in the history of biosphere had done that. The people would start burning landscapes, small and big fires, doing all kinds of things with it. I don't want to talk too much about it, but that is when humanity started doing things that other species hadn't done before. And that is why I think, also following Joop Goudsblom, who wrote a book about fire and fire use throughout history, that you could argue that that is when the Anthropocene started. It started small, but everything usually starts small. But that is where the human influence began to be visible in ways that were different from any other species. And as you can see, it's only 0.04% of the history of biosphere. It's not very long. And then, of course, humans started doing agriculture with profound effects on the biosphere. In a chapter in my book, I try to outline all of that, including a first survey of all those effects. And then you can say, okay, then it's the state formation, the food capturing pyramid formed by humans. Again, growing numbers, growing effects within the biosphere. And then roughly 500 years ago, people started connecting the continents. And as a result of the fact that all these plants and animals can grow so rapidly, non-linearly, they could transform whole continents very quickly, even though these boats were very small. And the same applies by itself also to agriculture, which also had profound non-linear effects. I could say a lot more about that. Again, the tip of an iceberg. And then you get industrial revolution, again, extraordinary profound effects within the biosphere and a new harvesting of energy. When with those both, obviously the energy harvesting was wind power, but here it became coal and later oil, etc. And also was some water power, etc. But you can always look at which kind of energy were harvested. You can say the fire revolution, more general, the fire agriculture revolution, the energy from plants and animals, the states, then you harvest energy from other people, the boats, wind power, and also water mills, and we can say a lot of other things. Industrial revolution, the coal and the oil, and then we find ourselves using that in the computer revolution, where we're trying to replace our brains with computers. And as part of that, all of that, then people went to the moon and at least temporarily extended the biosphere to the moon, one could argue. And now we find ourselves here with extraordinary large numbers of people in a very, very short period of time. So if you look at all of that, which all had very major biosphere consequences, it sort of tells us and explains how we got ourselves into our ecological predicament. That's how I look at it, at least. And you could say, well, it went so very quickly, seen from the standpoint of the history of the biosphere, that it appears, when humanity appeared, almost like a meteorite hit the biosphere and almost completely transformed it. Anyway, so this is my final slide. Now starting off referring back to the question that we started with, how we get ourselves into our current ecological predicament. So my answer is, in terms of theoretical concepts, it's human regimes and interactions, plus regimes in all of big history, plus the interactions, the question of what drives regimes, and then the question of joint effects of living regimes within the biosphere. Well, that's as far as I have come. There may be a lot more out there that I haven't seen yet. But to me, I think looking back on 40 years of a quest of trying to find out how we got ourselves into this situation, it feels like quite satisfactory progress. I'm not going to say all the questions have been resolved, far from it, but I do think it offers a much better perspective on the situation than I had 40 years ago. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. You in the